The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. A podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
Most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts. Hi, this is Toby. This is a intro to the Gone by Lunchtime podcast. Lots of podcasts happening at the moment. I just want to point out before we get into it in this conversation with Richard Adams that we recorded this one on Wednesday, July the 13th. And by the time you're listening to it, some events in relation to the Tory leadership race will have played out. So it's not like we weren't paying attention. Roll tape. Tēnā koutou katoa, welcome to a special pop-up one-off episode of Gone by Lunchtime. My name is Toby Manhire and I've got a special guest today, Richard Adams, who is the education editor at The Guardian. I worked with him there some years ago. Before that, he was at the Financial Times. He's also spent time in the United States working for The Guardian. And he's just landed in Auckland to visit New Zealand. He is a New Zealander for a few weeks. Did you get any sleep overnight, Richard? Welcome.
Kia ora. Yes, I did, surprisingly. We arrived about midnight last night and feeling relatively normal, although that may not last.
You and the family are going to career off down the North Island to, did you say Waitomo?
Yes, it's a very popular tourist destination, I believe.
Yeah.
And then a small town called Rotorua, which I believe is also some of your readers may be aware of. And then the capital city of New Zealand is called Wellington, and that is interesting and diverse city. So we're going to spend a couple of weeks there.
It's great to see you and have you back here home. How long have you been away from Aotearoa now?
I came back in October 2020, which was super spooky because obviously I flew. It was, the early scary part of COVID. The UK was in various lockdowns, and I spent 2 weeks in the Novotel in Christchurch Airport car park. Of which I have fond memories.
That's right. That's right.
And then I got out and everything, suddenly it was like COVID had never happened because life was normal and no masks and nothing. And then I went back to the UK and it was back into lockdown. And this time it's the reverse. I've come from, because everybody is over it in the UK and nobody really wears masks anymore and there's no precautions or anything. And life has pretty much returned to normal, and everyone's ignoring it. And then I come back here, and of course it's a real thing, and then masks are worn, and there are still some precautions taken. So it's kind of the reverse of the last time I was here.
It's sort of. I mean, we're not going to do a COVID podcast, I don't think, but it's as if a lot of people are over it, but it's not really over us. Certainly in New Zealand, you look at some of the numbers, the hospitalisation rates and so on. I guess the difference in the UK is that by contrast to that awful period, how long was it in total? Sort of 15 months, 18 months or something?
At least 18 months.
Where it was just horrible.
Yeah, it's only New Zealand is where the UK was 6 months ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to talk today a bit about the political events that have happened in the UK, the extraordinary political events, and we might touch on a bunch of other things. We'll see where the conversation leads us. I want to shout out to Spin-off members. You're a Spin-off member, aren't you?
I am.
Richard? Yeah. Who make these sorts of things possible. And thanks to Ti here for making this sound passable and beautiful even. The last few weeks in the UK have been amazing, and a lot of people who play a passing interest suddenly played quite a focused interest on this. You know, there's often been a pantomime quality around things to do with Boris and things to do with British politics in general, but this just seemed like an extraordinary episode, the climax of an extraordinary leadership. What was it? You're education focused, but you must have been watching it partly professionally and partly just as a resident of the United Kingdom with your jaw on the floor.
Right, and it's been, I mean, obviously since 2016 in the UK, politics in the UK has been up and down and all over the place because we've had a variety of events, most of which will be familiar to everyone. But the last few months have been even like all that on speed because we've had, there's a period of domestic politics where we had apart from the war in Ukraine, which was not obviously a domestic politics issue, but you go back to where there was a situation with a Conservative MP called Owen Paterson who was found to have broken various rules, and he should have been suspended as an MP for 30 days. That was what's going to happen.
This is going back about a year or so, is it?
Well, it's not even that long.
Yeah.
And this is the beginning. This is the root of everything.
The beginning of the end for Boris Johnson.
Right. And it's been a succession of stumbles ever since.
Yeah.
And Paterson, it was during the COP26, Boris Johnson left the conference in Edinburgh, flew to London, held a private dinner, and then tried to lobby MPs to let Paterson off the hook. And that failed, and it ended up with Paterson resigning. That triggered a by-election, which the Conservatives lost. And there's just been a cascade of bad news.
And he didn't just he tried to change the rules so that Paterson could stay.
He tried to change the rules. So we saw this sort of succession of things, and this was the same with what they call Partygate, which is the allegations that turned out to be true, and then worse than everybody even knew, about the various parties that had happened in Downing Street and around Boris Johnson while the rest of the UK was in COVID lockdown. And that was a source of deep unpleasantness. But and that was the real turning point for Boris.
And that had an impact, it seemed to me, watching from different distance, because it couldn't be played as palace politics, because it was for a lot of people who had made huge sacrifices, the sorts of people who had switched their vote to Boris because of Brexit, which we might get onto in a moment, for a range of other reasons, and think of, the lovable rogue, all that sort of thing. Suddenly it was personal, right?
Yes. So there was a lot of feeling that people had made lots of sacrifices, some more than others, people who'd postponed weddings, people who'd been unable to attend funerals of their parents or their family members at the same time as Boris Johnson was having birthday parties of various amounts. And Wine Time Friday, and they bought a fridge where they could put the wine in. I remember at one point we were walking around in Oxford in April, and we had bought some ice creams, and we sat down on a park bench in a graveyard. And so police drove past, stopped, got out, and told us we couldn't sit down on the park bench because of COVID outside. Yeah. At the very same time, Boris Johnson was hosting wine and cheese parties at number 10 Downing Street. So it wasn't like they didn't know what the rules were. They just, at some point, gave up thinking that they would be applied to them.
So Partygate kept rolling and rolling. There was a new story seemingly every week from all sorts of different quarters. The Sue Gray report, which is Boris sort of tried to kick it away every time he was asked about it. We need to wait for the Sue Gray report, came in. There were various findings, and the Met ended up fining Boris Johnson just for one, or was it two? I think just for one.
It was just one.
But that was kind of symbolically powerful enough.
The police had to be almost bullied into actually conducting an investigation. The Metropolitan Police wouldn't open an investigation, and it was only a lot of pressure and a lot of controversy, and eventually they did.
And Cressida Dick, who was the commissioner over the top of that, is now gone, of course, or soon to go. And that build-up happened, and he sort of kept clinging on, and then it kept going and going, and then eventually we ended up, after I think 2 more by-elections went disastrously.
Which were only 3 weeks ago.
Was that right? Yeah. Well, we ended up, it was just over a month ago. I mean, maybe there were previous by-elections. That was over a month ago. There was a confidence vote, which has that kind of wonderful kind of procedural element to it, where you needed to get, I think, whatever the percentage is of the number of MPs. I think it had to be 54 MPs, was it, or something like that?
Yeah, had to be, I think, 10% of the Parliamentary Conservative Party had to submit letters calling for a vote in confidence in the party leader, so not as Prime Minister, but as leader of the party.
And that's to the 1922 committee, and eventually that happened, that was tipped, and then there was a confidence vote, and it was, will this be it? But he survived, I was going to say a whisker, probably slightly more than that, like kind of by about 70 or 80. There's a very big parliamentary party, or caucus as we would call it in New Zealand, because of the size of the majority they got. He hung on, and one of the quirks of the rules that have been designed to avoid a constantly coup frothing situation in the party is that if you survive, you win this kind of immunity shell, is the idea, right?
That's right, for a year.
That you get a year.
You can't have another vote of no confidence for a year.
And so, in one sense, it was like he's done it again. He's managed to kind of slip his way. What did Cameron called him? The piglet, the greased piglet.
Right.
Had managed to squeeze his way out once again, but. Of course, it's more complex than that, and Theresa May found after she survived a vote, then she had a much slimmer majority, but she ended up going a relative short time after surviving or winning a confidence vote. And the same happened, then that brings us up to 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Right.
And then what played out?
Well, so then, so Boris Johnson won the first confidence vote for the 1922 committee, mainly because all of what they call the payroll vote was all the ministers and permanent private secretaries and all those people voted for him, but he lost on the sort of normal MP vote.
Yeah.
So the sort of MPs who weren't ministers, the majorities of those voted against him.
Those who didn't sort of owe their jobs to his largesse.
Exactly. And what happened subsequently, as a result of the latest situation, which was you had an MP who turned out to be sexually assaulting people, and this was well known, and it was known to Boris himself, even though he denied it. That was enough to trigger the payroll vote to desert him. So you had people like Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, resigning, and then there was this extraordinary couple of days last week. Monday and Tuesday of just this Tuesday and Wednesday of just the succession of ministers resigning, and then eventually even for Boris tried everything, and finally he ran out of road, and then that was it, and then he resigned.
It was that amazing situation. I mean, it reached fast level, didn't it? When you
really did.
People that he had appointed to senior positions to replace people who had resigned, then saying that he had to go, or even, in effect, issuing their own resignations.
There's one point, the Department for Education, which is obviously the area I cover, and at one point they had no ministers at all, or parliamentary undersecretaries. They had one minister who was in the House of Lords, and they don't resign in these situations. But so he had the Secretary of State for Education, Nadhim Zahawi, had been promoted to become Chancellor because Rishi Sunak had resigned. Boris then promoted another Education Minister, Michelle Donlan, to become Secretary of State for Education. And then 35 hours after she was appointed, she resigned, citing lack of confidence in Boris Johnson. The other junior ministers in the department all resigned. So we had a situation where there were no ministers at all in a department. Yeah, so it was ludicrous. It was becoming absolutely absurd. And the government was ceasing to function. that Parliament couldn't function because ministers couldn't appear to discuss things or bills that were going through Parliament. In the case of education, there are a whole bunch of schools that have a contractual relationship with the Department for Education where decisions can only be made by ministers.
Right.
So literally the state was ceasing to function until eventually even Boris realised that the end was up. But we saw the same pattern. So all these things would happen. We saw the same thing. There'd be an allegation made, whether it was parties or sexual harassment or wallpaper at Downing Street or all sorts of things. And this is the same case. The first thing would be a flat denial. Number 10 would just deny it. And then there'd be some evidence produced. And then the denials would still be made, but the language would be very carefully constructed. Boris Johnson wasn't aware of this, or that the government hadn't heard this allegation, or that because it was a government run by journalists, they had very journalistic priorities. One was to produce something that could fill pages in the following day's newspapers or broadcasts. So they'd come out with initiatives. They just announced stuff, even though it wasn't going to happen. They announced an education policy that 90% of primary school children were going to pass a certain level of maths and English by 2030. Well, 2030, nobody involved in the government now will probably be involved in 2030. It's but they announced it, and so that was on the front pages, and they were looking good. But without there was no funding, there were no policies attached to this. It was just an announcement. And then again, the denials, because journalists look for responses to allegations, and Boris Johnson's position was you just deny it. You just keep denying it until somebody can actually prove something, and then you deny it, then you admit that, but deny everything else. And that just erodes your position. And you had the situation where the special advisors for number 10 were just having to lie, and were then having to apologise to journalists for lying to them, which was a crazy situation because they are also civil servants and they're also bound by civil service codes.
It's interesting that you say that as a government of journalists, because obviously Boris Johnson is the exemplar of that insofar as, he was a well-known columnist, he was a former Times reporter, he got sacked from that job by Max Hastings, did he, if I recall correctly?
I think Max Hastings might have sacked him for another job.
But Max Hastings' columns on Boris over the years are just incredible, excoriating things to read. Yes. But then he was the editor of The Spectator, and famously he would at The Spectator pop into the office a couple of times a week. I mean, I don't know that we should tar all journalists with the same brush as him, but it is this sense that, as you say, is like a prime ministership in headlines. The whole thing, they're just not a details guy.
No.
And so we had these two massive headlines over the course of his premiership, which, by the way, isn't finished yet. He's going to stand down, so he says, but there are enough people who, for not without total reason, have kind of slightly conspiracy-level suspicions that he hopes that he might be able to hang on still. But there was Brexit, which was the big thing. Right. And then there was COVID that came along, and another massive thing. And, got Brexit done, make Brexit done, make Brexit happen, got Brexit. That was it. It was a big sweep. The details about Northern Ireland were never really addressed. Still remain a big challenge. Beyond that, those are massive things. It's amazing to think he's only been there 3 years. It seems like forever in some sense. Because of those new events. Right? Yeah. And but beyond that, it seemed like there wasn't really a plan, or at least that was one of the criticisms that was levelled. And at a certain point, his own party must have seen that there didn't seem. What I heard from distance, people keep on talking about levelling up, which I still don't really understand. This whole levelling up thing seems like something that's made up out of Westminster or.
Well, it's
a
great headline. It's a great headline. It's a great slogan. Yeah. It's a great headline. And again, the problem with government run by journalists and a very large number of MPs and ministers of the Conservative Party come from journalistic backgrounds or PR or marketing backgrounds. Yeah. So, for example, Michelle Donlan, who I mentioned, who was for 35 hours, the Secretary of State for Education, she used to work in marketing in the US for World Wrestling Entertainment. But there are a very large number. You look at the MPs, where they started off. They often started off in marketing, PR, advertising, sales, or those sorts of things of Conservative MPs, and that's a big change. I mean, that's famously the Conservative Party used to be like lawyers and soldiers and, the sort of professional classes as opposed to Labour. But that's now changed, and Labour is now the party in the UK is the party of the lawyers and the teachers and the sort of middle class professionals, whereas the Conservatives, certainly based on their MPs' backgrounds, are much more, marketing based, I think.
Interesting within that, the whole Dominic Cummings episode, which was one of many scandals that at times seemed massive and sort of barely got mentioned in the latest chaos. But of course, he breached COVID rules, and he was an extraordinary figure who was involved in the Brexit campaign and a sort of this Svengali character who had all these unorthodox approaches and sort of thought of himself as a bit of a super genius, still does, and is quite compelling. But was he able to gain that foothold, incredible level of control that makes Alistair Campbell for Blair seem relatively minimal, because they were susceptible to that kind of, they were awestruck by it? What happened?
Well, so I've known Dominic for a number of years because he was special advisor to Michael Gove when Michael Gove was the Secretary of State for Education. And David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, tried to block Cummings' appointment. Cummings was regarded as a dangerous character. In fact, he is a much more attractive character inside the Conservative Party for lots of interesting reasons. One is that the Conservative Party, like lots of modern centre-right parties, are very much in thrall to the Republican Party in the United States. The Republican Party in the United States is seen as, in this sort of Anglo-Saxon democracies, the great success story.
Still today, or historically?
Yes,
really?
Yes.
Right.
I mean, I'm talking about the last 10 to 20 years.
Okay.
It's remarkable position of dominance that it's managed to take what I think on the face of it are unpopular policies and make them palatable. And to be electorally successful, generally speaking. And also that the people who support the Republican Party of the United States are very wealthy people who also tend to support other causes and centre-right and further-right organisations in other parts of the world. So a lot of think tanks in the UK, for example, are funded by the same people who fund the Republican Party in the US. And that's all on the record. I don't think it's particularly conspiracy theory-ish. Now, the problem is the right, and those people have very narrow policy objectives, and they tend to be religiously conservative. They tend to be opposed to abortion. They tend to be opposed to trans and gay rights, and they tend to be in favour of lower taxes generally. And the trouble is, those are quite narrow and not actually particularly helpful from a domestic point of view. And you'll see the National Party in this country have the same problems. So they have wealthy American and American-related backers who want to fund these sorts of things. But these are not fantastic policy ideas. Cummings, and the reason why Dominic Cummings is interesting here is he comes along and he has a policy agenda which is not connected to any of these, the transatlantic rich think tank world. He's actually got a British-based alternative that he can offer you, and that makes him much more attractive. So he wouldn't, he didn't think banging on about abortion, the things that the American think tanks were really keen on, was very useful in a British political context. So that's why he offered a real alternative to Conservatives, so some other policies that they could work on that weren't this really narrow transatlantic unpalatable stuff. And that's why he was, successful within the Conservative Party.
But once he got into number 10, he wielded an extraordinary amount of power, didn't he? For an unelected official.
Well, because Boris Johnson was not particularly interested in details. And he was trusted by Johnson and by Gove, who was Michael Gove is a key supporter of Boris Johnson. And so they placed him, and they had a wide distrust of the existing civil service.
Yes.
And the other policy options that they were being offered, like I say, were these sort of stale, reheated American-style, right-wing stuff. And he comes along and he's talking about the levelling up agenda, which you say is a great slogan. What does that actually mean? Well, it means you're pushing government funding away from the southeast of England to the north of England, the northeast, of England, where income levels were a lot lower, educational outcomes were a lot worse, life expectancy is lower. And these are seats in areas that have traditionally supported Labour. And that suddenly, in the last election...
Many of them the Red Wall.
Right. So the Red Wall, which is a terrible phrase, but it was, northern Labour supporting seats for many years. And suddenly the Conservatives, who had this landslide election, they won a lot of seats they didn't expect. And what happens in those situations is you start winning in places that you really weren't counting on. And so as a result, you start getting some slightly unusual candidates who you didn't think would win elections suddenly become MPs. And that's a problem. But and we've seen that play out a couple of times recently. So the idea was they would capitalise on this, that there had been this historic reformation of British politics that Brexit had allowed, that Brexit cut across party lines, and that Cummings's idea was that the Conservatives should capitalise on this, and they should have policies that are more attractive to the north of England rather than to the traditional support base in the south of England.
And to bring that back to Boris Johnson, by winning that Red Wall, that historic victory, he gained a mandate. Well, as he saw it, he gained a mandate, and that's what played out, notwithstanding his own, I think, probably kind of pathological levels of Boris exceptionalism and all of that, seized on the idea all the way through, and especially in these last few months, that he was the one who had been voted into power, that it was all about him. He got Brexit done. He'd been given a mandate by the British people, and it was somehow insurrectional or inappropriate or unethical or wrong for the MPs, who were actually the ones that were elected, to be thinking about defenestrating him. Like that, he even in that speech he gave.
Yes, even his resignation
Downing
speech.
Street.
Yeah.
Not an iota of contrition.
No.
The idea that it was eccentric of his colleagues, I think were his words.
Yep.
He still doesn't. He still seems to believe that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to fathom his psychological state, but I mean, it's odd. I mean, not that long ago, he was elected to this massive majority. Now the UK doesn't have a presidential system, but it does. Like here, there's a lot of focus on the political party leaders. So although people say, well, it's not a presidency, so Boris Johnson is somehow giving himself ears that he doesn't deserve. But there is so much concentration on the personality of leaders, especially in the last election, because you had Jeremy Corbyn, who's leader of the Labour Party, who was widely distrusted by large sections of the community. The community, I mean the electorate, but including traditional Labour Party supporters. So one of the reasons why Boris did very well is that Labour had a particularly weak position, and that's not going to happen again. Well,
it is a great campaigner, Boris Johnson as well. We're very good at it. We've talked about the slogans. I watched PMQs, the Prime Minister's Question Time, the sort of rough equivalent of what we call Question Time in Parliament here, on the sort of in that period of the 36 hours or 48 hours or whatever it is, and under questioning from Keir Starmer, who again we might talk about it briefly in a minute. His response to these sort of devastating unanswerable questions was, well, you would have had the member for Islington North, aka Jeremy Corbyn. He was still trying to use Jeremy Corbyn as a club with which to beat. That's what he was left with.
And one of the many resignation letters that Boris Johnson received was one from Nadhim Zahawi, who was resigning as Chancellor. No, he wasn't resigning as Chancellor. He was threatening to resign as Chancellor of the Exchequer.
He was saying you should go.
He's saying you should go.
After being Chancellor for 10 minutes.
But in his letter, which was on government notepaper, he listed Boris Johnson's achievements, and one of them was the defeat of a dangerous anti-Semite, who he didn't name, but presumably was Jeremy Corbyn. I think Jeremy Corbyn had a very clear case for libel there. He should probably talk to lawyers. But so the sort of very quick rewriting of history for Boris Johnson as he was the only one who stood between Britain and Jeremy Corbyn, which is hard to imagine.
And one of the reasons I think that it was was sort of disorganized. There was no real coup attempt, right? Like, I mean, and was because there was no obvious successor. There was no one person who was really driving. I want to replace Boris Johnson, and that has been made clear, if it wasn't already, by the early stages of the race to succeed Boris Johnson. That we had, I think overnight, you may not be up to speed on this because you've been on an airplane for 30 hours, but it's whittled down to 8 now.
I've seen that. Yeah, I have seen that.
And the way the process works is that the parliamentary Conservative Party, what we would call the caucus, the MPs, vote, and they've set a 20 threshold this time. I think that's the point at which we're talking on Wednesday, the 13th of July. This podcast won't go out for a few days, so things will have advanced by the time people are listening to this. But you have quite a wide field in many ways, and that number will be whittled down, I should say, to 2, and then the membership of the Conservative Party will choose not just the leader of the Conservative Party, but the Prime Minister, which is a curious state of affairs, but not unprecedented. Do you have any views on how that will shake down? I mean, it might well shake down to being Rishi Sunak versus the former Chancellor versus Liz Truss, who still is the Foreign Secretary. She's got the support of the slightly unhinged Boris devotees in the form of Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nadine Dorries, who are like something out of a David Williams sketch show. How do you have any views? I mean, this is a hard question because, as I say, things might have moved on by the time you answer it. Do you see that there's an obvious person who would be best for the Conservative Party, and, which may be a different question, best for the country, which could probably use a period of stability?
So, of the 8 candidates that I think are extant, the 2 that you might describe as moderate in the context of the Conservative Party. One is Jeremy Hunt, the former Health Secretary, who's been an opponent of Boris, and in fact stood against Boris last time. Yep. He's quite a significant figure. He's quite serious. He's all the things that Boris really isn't. And the other one is Penny Mordaunt, who is a kind of quite lightly qualified minister who has a sort of quite centrist positions on things. So those 2 are sort of relatively centred. The other 6 are sort of fighting for the sort of, the Johnsonian inheritance. And that is, I think, really, really difficult to say how that will play out. I mean, even in that 6, there's a subgroup that has, Rishi Sunak, who again was Boris Johnson's Chancellor of the Exchequer, but has been an opponent and had opposed him on various sort of tax and spending issues, but it's really hard to tell who was opposing what, so or why, or who really wanted tax cuts and who didn't, and then you have the others who are, I think, largely fighting over the same territory. Rather depressingly, they're all talking about how they want to cut taxes and they're going to step up the culture wars. Yeah. And so you have quite a common theme from all the candidates is the what they call the war on woke. So the culture wars, which don't really amount to much, because when you've been in government for 12 years, as the Conservatives have, they can't really talk about their record much. They can talk about the record, but they can't talk about making radical changes because that would imply changes to the
status quo.
They are responsible for almost everything that is the case in the British society and certainly in England at the moment. So, if you couldn't come in and say, I will transform England's schools because they've been transformed supposedly for the last 12 years. There is one candidate I would keep an eye out, and that's Kemi Badenoch, who's supported by Michael Gove. She would probably be unfamiliar to most people, and most people in the UK as well as in New Zealand. She's very young.
She hasn't been in cabinet.
She hasn't been in cabinet. Well, she was Treasury Secretary, I think, which is a cabinet, but she wasn't the level of a cabinet minister of state. So the technicalities don't really apply. But she's not held a big spending department. She's extremely right wing.
She's war on woke as well, isn't she?
She's extremely war on woke. She's gone out of her way to, everybody in the Conservative Party at the moment is pretty much signed up to war on woke. Some people are sort of more enthusiastic about it than others, and she is very enthusiastic about it. She's supported by Michael Gove, who is about as establishment a figure, I suppose, the modern parliamentary Conservative Party has.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the pōtiki of the taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirehama for Ko Papa Ko Rangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komato Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spin-Off Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBit.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
What about on the other side of the House? The Labour Party is still putting itself back together a bit, trying to unify, bring back in some of the people who were either pushed out or deserted. This is just within the parliamentary party during the Corbyn years, and things got pretty ugly there. I don't know if that's repaired yet. How would you diagnose the state of the Labour Party in 2022?
Well, they've electorally they've improved. I mean, there's no question about that. You just look at the opinion polls, and that's a function of partly Boris Johnson's unpopularity, but it's also partly the state of the economy. And the cost of living is the big non-Boris Johnson-related political issue.
Which is familiar to everyone in New Zealand.
Although I suspect that elements of it will be worse in the UK because a lot of these issues have been made worse by Brexit. So Brexit has led to a dislocation in the trading arrangements, and that's caused shortages and price rises, and it's hampered exports in a way that, so it's on top of everything else, on top of the Ukraine COVID.
The lorries rolling across the channel with to stock the shelves in Tesco times.
But it's also the combination of things like energy prices are gone up by vast amounts because as a result of policies that have been in place for the last
And the war in Ukraine, presumably.
And the war in Ukraine also has an impact, although that's something that's still in the pipeline. I mean, the major impact will be, Brexit and COVID, obviously. But the COVID effect is fading. I mean, it's still being felt from places like China, which, obviously the impact on the manufacturing sector there is still pretty immense.
But Keir Starmer, former Director of Public Prosecutions, is safe in his role at this point. There isn't speculation around his leadership?
No. I mean, there was briefly when he was being investigated for a breach of the COVID rules. And there was a kind of bizarre situation on the day when all the ministers were resigning because of Boris, where the Durham police force announced that they were going to come to a decision about whether he would be fined for breaching the rules. And he had said, to provide a clear contrast to Boris Johnson, he had said if he was fined, he would step down as Labour leader. So we could have had this kind of position where everybody was resigning, but the Durham police force didn't take that into account and decided to let him off. So as a result, he's obviously a bit stronger. I think because Labour has won a couple of good by-elections recently, and because they're doing so well in the opinion polls, and having a barrister confronting Boris Johnson every week over legal issues has been quite helpful. I think he's pretty safe at the moment, but we've got a new Conservative leader. The Tory party will inevitably have a bounce. Once they get rid of Boris Johnson, there will be a bounce because, there's a lot of drama and people will be tired of that. And a new leader gives, everybody a chance for a fresh start. So I think we need to wait a few months to see how that shakes out, basically.
The leader of the National Party in New Zealand, Christopher Luxon, has come into the role after the National Party here went through some tumultuous years, to put it mildly, and he's provided a modicum, some real kind of calm, and there's some discipline and some unity and an end to the leaking and the civil war. He was in the UK recently, doing a sort of tiki tour. He went to Singapore, he went to Ireland, he went to London, and he went on one of the things he was there to do was to look at the education system, which is something that you spend your working days studying. What is there to learn from the education system in the UK at the moment? Whatever side you're coming from in politics, are there parts of the education system in the UK that, I'm not expecting you to be an expert on the education system in New Zealand, but that are going sufficiently well that they might be picked up by other Western liberal democracies?
Well, I would say just generally, I think it's very difficult to make comparisons between education systems. But I would say there are some surprisingly good things about the English education system. And when I say English, I really do mean English.
You mean English, yeah.
Because education has devolved. So Scotland runs its own schools and universities. Wales runs its own schools and universities. England runs its own. So when we talk about education ministers in the Conservative Party, they're all about England because the SNP runs education, the Scottish National Party in Scotland, and there's a Labour Liberal coalition in Wales. So that's not really a coalition; it's complex. But and they are very separate. So schools in England. One of the things that the previous Labour Party, Labour government, and their subsequent governments, the coalition and Conservative governments, have focused on as being what they call the attainment gap, which is the gap between the lowest achieving pupils and the highest achieving pupils, and trying to reduce that. And there's a political consensus that that's an important thing to look at. And so there's a level of dialogue in the UK and England which you don't really hear here so much. I think, from what I can tell. And one of the ways they've sought to deal with that is they've sought to produce lots of data. So the English school system has a variety of data that's readily accessible, which you don't really see in many other countries in the world. It's unusual in that regard. And
is this mostly kind of assessment based, or are there a wider range of metrics?
So there are a lot of metrics, and one of the metrics they focus on, and they have done especially recently post COVID, is there's a lot of concern about attendance. So there's research that shows that children who don't attend school, who you might call truants, although no one uses that word, who are absent for whatever reason, the higher the rates of absence, the lower their attainment is.
Right.
So that's in exams in later life. Sure. And there's a pretty direct connection. Now, the trouble is the children who are most likely to be absent are also from lower socioeconomic groups or from ethnic minorities that are in lower socioeconomic groups. So it's not just attendance, obviously, but it's one of the factors that we see. And one of the things that has been the case for the last decade is it's become harder and harder for children to be absent from school in England.
Why?
Because schools have to take it seriously. So head teachers have very little leeway in what they can allow. So up until 10 years ago, for example, what you would see is middle-class families typically asking the head teachers of their schools, could they take the kids off for a couple of weeks to go to Florida, to go to Disneyland in the off-season where it was a lot cheaper. And the heads would have discretion, they could allow that, and that's gone. They have no discretion. unauthorised absences are not allowed for any reason. And if a child is absent for a long enough period of time to concern the school, then they contact the local authority, and the local authority will fine the parents. And you get a fine of between £30 and £60 a day for each day the child is absent. And if you don't pay the fine, then you go to jail. And that happens.
We were in a conversation a month or two ago, and again, I'm not going to ask you to do analysis on the New Zealand system, but you were struck by the lack of ambition or the relatively low numbers for attendance or for truancy, to flip it around, in New Zealand that the minister announced here recently.
I remember looking at attendance stats in New Zealand a couple of years ago and being a bit surprised about how poor they were. And then the government has announced an attendance strategy, and that made me look at the attendance figures in a bit more depth. And it struck me of how many children are absent in New Zealand for substantial periods of time, 10% of days. It's far higher rate than most other countries, certainly in like OECD countries. And that's, I think, a real concern, because I'm not talking here about the COVID period, because that has created its own problems with attendance. Because obviously children who've got COVID or whose parents have got COVID or immunocompromised. There's and schools have been closed and so on. So that's created complications and working out what the numbers actually are. But leaving that to one side, New Zealand's had a pretty terrible attendance track record for quite a while, I suspect. And I don't know what in detail the policies that are being offered will actually tackle it, other than flagging it up as a problem.
One more thing on education. Christopher Luxon, when he was in London, went for a visit to somewhere called Michaela School, and he lavished praise on it and said it was an example of people. Tell us a bit about Michaela School.
So Michaela School is a very interesting school. It's very controversial and well known in the UK. There's documentaries about it if people want to Google it. So it's a free school, which is free schools are schools that are set up under an initiative introduced by Michael Gove.
Charter school is a rough.
You would call it a charter school here. Yeah. So they were founded. They could be theoretically founded by groups of concerned parents, or in this case, Michaela School was founded by a head teacher called Catherine Singh, who was actually born in New Zealand and then grew up in Canada. But she made headlines. She gave a speech to the Conservative Party conference in 2010. She was working in a school in London, and she was saying the speech was about how bad schools were. She was then fired by her school for doing this.
Right.
And it made quite a stir. So she then set up the Michaela School, which is a free school in Brent, which is a part of London, which is one of the more deprived areas. Very high percentage of children eligible for free school meals, which means they're from very poor backgrounds in the context of London. And the school opened, and it's quite a controversial school because it is very, very strict. To the extent that children are not allowed to speak when moving between classrooms during the school day. All children have to attend lessons with a pen, a pencil, a rubber, a ruler, some other things. And if they don't, they receive a detention. And I've been into classrooms in Michaela, and I've seen them. At the start of the lesson, the children will have to hold up a clear plastic pencil case. With all the rubbers and pencils and all the things, and they all have to hold it up. There are no mirrors in the toilets, for example. Makeup is banned. Jewellery is banned. There are no mobile phones, and everything, the smallest thing receives a detention, and it's extremely strict. And Singh's view is that the kids who go to her school need that structure. And when I've spoken to her in detail and said, she believes that all children in all schools would benefit from these. And in fact, I was talking to her about some of schools like Eton, where Boris Johnson went, which is a private school. And she said, yes, I've been to these schools, and they're all terribly lazy and rude. And her view was that they have these kids from wealthy backgrounds who just do nothing because they don't need to. And in fact, they would benefit from this. So there has been a movement in some schools like hers, and hers is not the only one like this, It's described as what the teachers involved often describe it as strict warm policies, that they're strict warm. So
which sounds like a kind of weird play on tough love, doesn't it?
Yeah, it kind of is.
That sort of, it's their boot camp mentality in a way, isn't it? We're gonna give you a hug, but only after we've been very strict all day.
Right. And Michaela carried this to an extreme. I don't mean that they punish the children extremely, because I don't think they do. The detentions they receive are relatively minor ones.
They're not getting the whip out.
No, not at all. But for example, all the corridors in Michaela have, and the carpet, there's a dividing line down the carpet.
Yeah.
So with the children, and it's in a cramped central city location, when the children are moving between classes, they're only going in one direction on one side of the corridor.
I tried that on Oxford Street for a while, I think. I don't know if it lasted.
I don't know.
And is it too soon to have any kind of empirical evidence of whether it works?
They had one set of, before COVID came along and they cancelled exams for 2 years, they had a bunch of, they had the GCSE, which is the 16-year-old, the NCEA equivalent, and they were phenomenally good results. I mean, I'm not surprised, having seen the school and seen it in action. But I've seen the Catherine Birbals thing speak to parents, and she says literally to the parents, this school is very strict. If you don't like it, go somewhere else. And that's her pitch. So you decide to go to the Michaela school, and because of the way school choice works in England, people actually have to pick it.
Yeah.
And she says, this is how we work. And if you don't like it, go somewhere else. And that means that the only people who do send the children there are already signed up to this idea. Right. So it works for that reason.
So there's a sort of version of a selection bias, arguably.
Absolutely. If it was done in some sort of other, basis, then it might not be so successful.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to let you go and drive off to Waitoma. That's really, really interesting conversation. And I should repeat that you've done this after arriving after midnight, I think, in Auckland, and then you've been dragged into the Spin-Off to chat with us.
It's a pleasure. I'm
really appreciate it.
I'm a huge fan of the Spin-Off. I think it's fantastic.
Oh, well, it's great to see you. Great to have you here. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Jaya. Thank you to members who keep us going.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, Senior Writer at The Spin-Off. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spin-Off. You can help us keep all of The Spin-Off's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.